This is a special report from ABC News Digital.
I'm Dan Kleffler in New York with this ABC News Digital special report. 11 hours now until the government shuts down for the first time since the original Toy Story movie was in theaters. That is some historical perspective for you. And as that clock does wind down, no new negotiations on Capitol Hill. We're joined from Washington by political director Rick Klein, who's been watching this all. And Rick, I know both sides are working at this, both chambers working at this. The Senate poised to send a clean bill with Obamacare fully funded. But the question is, are there enough numbers in the House to get it through?
We got lots of time, right? You could watch all the Toy Story movies before midnight, I'm pretty sure. This is a critical question now, and it all revolves around House Speaker John Boehner. What does he want to do? He can make this happen very easily. If he were to bring a vote up right now on the floor of the House, he'd get virtually all the Democrats and the Republicans to join him. The government would stay open. The president could sign it before midnight, and we could all have an early evening and a nice dinner. That's not going to happen. The reason it's not going to happen is that Speaker Boehner doesn't want to lose his job over this. But what's going on underneath the surface is very important and interesting right now. There are a growing number of House Republicans who feel like they have fought this fight long enough, and they're not going to ever concede that they're waving any white flags, but they also feel like they have made the point that they need to make, and that they feel like it's time for Speaker Boehner to just bring this to the floor and be done with it. That's the point that Speaker Boehner has been making for weeks now. He's wanted to be over this fight before it even started, but he had to let off some steam with the Tea Party members. We could be fast approaching the time in this debate, though, where they feel like they've had their say, and we move on to fight another day.
Well, you made a great point, Rick, in the fact that a lot of Republicans may be publicly saying that they, in fact, would support this, but when it actually comes down to a vote, are they actually going to follow those words? So how many numbers and how big of a contingency does Boehner have to get behind him with Democrats already on the side?
Well, Democrats are almost certainly going to join him and join him in large numbers. He's got to think about it as a simple math equation. 233 Republicans in the House, 217 is a majority. So if you lose just 17, 20 of them, and then all of a sudden you're down beneath the number, he's going to lose more like 80 of them. That's the number of Tea Party members who say they won't fund the government unless Obamacare is out of there. So he has to make up all of that ground, get 60, 70, 80 plus Democrats. Thing is, there are Democrats that are ready to help him. They see this as a chance to deliver a blow to Speaker Boehner, that he'd be doing this only after being forced into doing it by the facts on the ground. And they feel like it's the better thing to do, that if you could get funding for the government to continue and keep Obamacare intact, that would be a victory for them. So I wouldn't say Democrats are dancing in the end zone quite yet, but they are feeling good about where they stand.
All right, we want to go to the White House now, where Jay Carney is briefing the press. Let's listen to his comments.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your patience. Of course, I wanted to make sure that you heard the President's remarks at the end of his bilateral meeting with the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, at which, in addition to his comments about the meeting, about our relationship with Israel, our unshakable support for Israel's security, the discussions the two leaders had about Syria and Iran and the Middle East peace process, among other things, the President took a question and answered it about the fact that as of now, it is up to the House of Representatives to decide whether or not they want to shut down the government in order to make an ideological point, or whether they will follow the Senate's lead and pass a extension of government funding at current levels for a number of weeks, so that we can get about the business of discussing and negotiating a longer-term budget agreement. With that, I will take your questions.
Thanks, Jay. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the President just said about having conversations with leaders on the Hill? Does that include Speaker Boehner, and is he making any progress in these talks toward averting a shutdown?
I think the President said what we've said, which is that you can expect that he will be having conversations with leaders on the Hill, as he has in the past. And I assume that would include the Speaker of the House. The point, I think, though, is that we are at a moment where the House of Representatives has to decide, and the Speaker of the House, as the leader of the House and the leader of House Republicans, must decide whether roughly 60 members of his caucus, the Tea Party faction, will dictate to the American people whether the government will shut down, because they have not been able to achieve through normal means their ideological agenda, which is to repeal and do away with in some manner or other the Affordable Care Act. The irony, of course, being that tomorrow enrollment begins in the Affordable Care Act, and millions of Americans for whom access to affordable insurance has been but a dream, there will be the opportunity to enroll in the Affordable Care Act through the exchanges and the marketplaces and receive, come January 1st, affordable health insurance for the first time. And that's going to happen. Nothing will alter that. That will happen.
So a couple of follow-ups on that. Can you say whether he's spoken yet to Speaker Boehner?
I don't have any other conversations or new conversations to read out. I think what the President indicated is that he expects that he will, of course, speak with leaders in the coming days. Again, there's nothing here to debate. That the President has made clear all year long that he is willing and eager to negotiate over our budget priorities and to reach a common sense solution to funding our government. That's what his budget was about, which many of you wrote about and correctly assessed to represent compromise. And we have encouraged Republicans to show the same willingness to compromise all year long, and the President has met with many members of Congress of the Republican Party over the course of the year to have those discussions. What he will not do is go along with the idea that the government should be shut down over this desire to unwind history and achieve through threat and extortion what Republicans couldn't do through the legislative process or through the election process. It's just not fair to the American people. It's not fair to the millions of Americans who will have access to affordable health insurance for the first time.
Would the President veto a continuing resolution that only included a provision killing the medical device tax?
We have said that none of this is acceptable. This is just a blatant extortion. And the irony about it is, like the Republicans will tell you, the Republicans who support this extortion game or extortion racket will tell you that, oh, well, you know, that's compromise. We just want you to do this on the Affordable Care Act and chip away at it here or delay there. And yet they'll all also tell you very quite clearly that the ultimate goal and purpose of this is to do away with the Affordable Care Act, so take away all those benefits from millions of Americans and increase the deficit dramatically while doing it, something they never mention. But in the end, they want to do that for a continuing resolution that will fund the government for 45 days, 60 days. What comes next? What will they demand next? I mean, part of it was they want everybody's boss to be able to tell every woman in America that whether or not they can get contraceptive coverage. They want to attach that to this debate. You know, this is not, as others have said, this is not the way Congress ought to operate, and it's irresponsible and reckless to hold the functioning of the government hostage to these ideological imperatives.
There's no sign of any movement, Jay. Isn't a shutdown inevitable this evening?
Well, the President said just now, and I certainly agree with him, that no, that he is not resigned to a shutdown because there's an avenue open to the House after the Senate does what we expect, which is send back to the House a clean CR that just continues funding the government at current levels. It contains no concessions to the Democratic agenda or the President's agenda. Just continues funding the government at current levels for a number of weeks in order to allow for the negotiations the President is eager to engage in. That's the responsible thing to do. The irresponsible thing to do is to attach a bunch of political, ideological demands to this simple proposition of funding the government and not shutting it down, and say you'll shut it down if you don't get what you want.
You're not detecting any signs of any movement.
Well, I used to walk the halls of Congress as a reporter, and back then knew a lot more about the minute-by-minute developments. In fact, I did that during the last government shutdown, here in '95 and up there in '96. But I leave it to your colleagues to tell me more precisely what the thinking of the House Republican leadership is.
How will a shutdown affect White House staffing?
Well, the White House, like other agencies within government is affected. There will be reductions in staff. We'll have a skeletal staff. There's obviously essential staff that's exempted or accepted, which I think is the proper term, and that's true in other areas. But it will be a extremely lean operation if this comes to pass.
And lastly, will he go on this trip to Asia this weekend?
We don't have any changes to announce. We plan to make this trip. The president, as president, looks forward to and believes it is important to travel to Asia in order to promote our economic interests in Asia and our strategic interests in Asia. There are American jobs that can be created through our engagement with Asia, this fastest growing region of the world, and an enormously important region when it comes to our trading relationships and partnerships. So, we have this trip scheduled, and we intend to take it. We'll see, obviously, what happens as the week unfolds. I'm going to move around a little bit, if I may. April.
I want to follow up on what Steve said. You said there will be a skeletal staff and a lean operation, indeed, if the shutdown happens. Could you get into the breakdown? Could you give us numbers?
I would refer you to the Office of Management and Budget, which handles all of these specifics and can give you more information about how it breaks down. But those of you who know from if you're as old as I am and remember what it was like in the mid-'90s, and remember also what you reported just when there was at least the potential of a shutdown, there are significant reductions in staff and furloughs that take place here as elsewhere if a shutdown occurs.
And that staff that will be not coming in or furloughed will not be paid, correct?
Again, that's my understanding, but I hesitate to answer these kind of technical questions because there are far better sources for that specific information.
And we're understanding that today that even the White House is trying to still parse through all the technicalities of the effects on the White House from a shutdown. Is that the case? And if so, could you talk to us about some of the things that you're dealing with?
Look, here's the thing. There are effects here, and there are effects throughout the government, but those pale in comparison to the effects and impacts that a shutdown would have on women and children and seniors. Shortly after a shutdown, if it were to occur, federal funding for the Women, Infants, and Children program may not be sufficient to cover benefits, and agencies may have to cut off services to mothers and young children. Senior nutrition grants, which help approximately 2.5 million seniors annually, help them remain healthy and independent by providing meals and related services, would not be funded. Programs that our nation's veterans depend on would be affected. For example, veterans call centers and regional offices would be closed immediately, effective immediately. So those services that help veterans understand their benefits, including call centers, hotlines, and regional offices, would be closed. Vocational rehabilitation and education counseling for veterans would be limited. Veterans business support centers would be immediately closed. And should a lapse extend through late October, compensation, pension, education, and other veterans' benefits would be cut off. Important research and consumer safety programs would be halted in the event of a shutdown, including research into life-threatening diseases, work to protect consumers, ranging from child product safety to financial security to the safety of hazardous waste facilities, would cease. The Sandy recovery efforts, the West Texas investigation, and other fire and emergency response grants would be halted. And on that, I just want to point out that when it comes to emergency disaster relief, there is the fund that is operational. So should there be a disaster, there would be funding available for initial and immediate emergency relief. But what would be affected by a shutdown are the ongoing Sandy recovery efforts and the investigation into the explosion in West Texas and the like. So those are the impacts and effects that matter. We like every other agency would be affected, but it's folks out in the country who will be affected that concerns us most.
Okay, thank you for that information. But again, how will the president plan to go to Asia if there's a skeleton crew and a lean operation here, and then also how
again, the
ACA
president
affects?
said today, not long ago, that he is not resigned to the idea that the government will shut down. He remains hopeful that the House will come to the reasonable decision that it is appropriate to simply extend funding of the government further for several weeks in order to allow for the kind of negotiations that they claim they want about our budget priorities. So he remains hopeful, or at least not resigned to the fact of a shutdown. And when it comes to the mechanics of the trip and the people and equipment that gets positioned abroad for a trip like this, I just would have to refer you to OMB or to the agencies involved, Department of Defense, Secret Service. Jim, and then John.
Jay, one of the other proposals floating around up on Capitol Hill would be a really, really short-term CR, something along the lines of a week to keep the government running. You from this podium in the past have described that as sort of toll booth government, or even these continuing resolutions as toll booth government. Wouldn't a 1 week CR be sort of the ultimate toll booth government? Well,
I'm not going to respond to ideas floating around the Hill. There are tons of them, and we can respond all day to them. Right now, the option available, as I understand it, to the House, to the Speaker, will be the opportunity to follow the Senate's lead in funding the government for a number of weeks in a clean continuing resolution, and we would support that. This process, again, has been one where a small faction, a very extreme faction of Republicans in the House, has essentially forced its leadership to go along with the proposition that it is better to shut down the government with all of the negative effects that we've talked about, and better perhaps to default on our obligations for the first time in history than to allow a law that was passed and signed and upheld by the Supreme Court to be implemented. A law that would provide millions of Americans who do not have insurance access to affordable insurance. And one might surmise that the extreme agita that you see among Republicans right now over the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare is a direct result of the fact that beginning tomorrow, there is a concrete development that means that millions of Americans will for the first time be able to sign up for that health insurance. And as I think I've seen Republicans say, it'll be a lot harder to get rid of Obamacare once these individuals who have had a hard time getting affordable health care are able to see the benefits that the Affordable Care Act provides to them. So,
the White House might be okay with a 1 week CR.
Again, I'm not going to negotiate ideas that are floated to me from any row of this briefing room, except to say that, we don't think extraneous political agenda items ought to be, well, maybe from the front, but I think I'll just make it blanket opposition to that. But just let me just say that Congress ought to do its job. It only has a few absolute functions, and one of them is to ensure that the government and its essential operations are funded. Another is to ensure that the United States pays its bills, as it has throughout the entire history of the nation.
And Jay, let me just follow up real quick. In the last couple of weeks, Democrats, including the president, have, and he has not used all of these words, but I'll throw out some of them that have been used, have referred to Republicans as arsonists, anarchists, extortionists, blackmailers.
I think I just said extortion
hostage takers.
Racket, yeah.
Dan Pfeiffer talked about bombs being strapped to chests. It almost sounds as if this White House is trying to taunt Republicans into shutting the government down.
Well, that's certainly not the case. I mean, as I think I just saw my colleague Dan Pfeiffer on CNN's air not long ago say that I think it was Mitch McConnell who, in this iteration of these negotiations, similar ones 2 years ago, who referred to the economy being a hostage that they could take in the negotiations with the president. So I don't think this is language that either side has exclusive rights to or has only used in the past. But here's the facts. When it comes to funding the government or when it comes to paying our debts, the Democrats and the president, on the one hand, are asking for nothing. No concessions, no ideological riders, no special pet projects, no political gotcha items, in exchange for the simple extension of government funding, in exchange for Congress ensuring that we do not default. Republicans, on the other hand, are attaching in the concrete bills that they've passed and in their imaginations anyway, when they talk about what they'd like to attach, all sorts of political agenda items, some of them wildly inconsistent with where the American people want the country to move. And that includes issues that are wholly unrelated to the budget and wholly unrelated to the debt and the deficits that we must manage, and the responsibility of Congress to ensure that we don't default. John Allen.
Two questions, Jay. One, following on Jim, this is no longer such a hypothetical. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has hotlined a one-week CR in the Senate within the last few minutes, maybe hour. So it looks like there's some movement on that on Capitol Hill. And you said that Congress has the responsibility to keep the government funded. I wonder what the president signed.
Well, you just mentioned this happened in the last couple of minutes, so I'm not going to give you a statement of administration policy, except to say that it has long been our position that Congress ought to make sure that the government doesn't shut down, and they ought not to attach to their responsibility to ensure that the government doesn't shut down any ideological poison pills or any agenda items that they can't achieve through the normal process. But we'll have to see what Congress does. There's a lot of movement in Congress that doesn't result in actual action.
And on the Affordable Care Act, will the president be doing anything tomorrow to promote the rollout, and can you talk a little bit about what the White House is going to be doing more broadly?
Well, I don't have any information at this time for you on the president's schedule tomorrow. It is certainly the case, and I appreciate you bringing it up, that Department of Health and Human Services and others are engaged in preparing for tomorrow's opening day of enrollment, and there's a lot of activity around that. And it will be the first day of a 6-month open enrollment period for individuals to basically shop for health insurance in a way that they've never been able to before, and for so many of them to have options available to them at affordable prices that they've never had before. And we expect that when those marketplaces open and the exchanges open, and you can, as a consumer, review your options either online or through the telephone call centers, there'll be a lot of window shopping. A lot of people will assess what's available to them, and then as time passes and we move closer to January 4th, more and more of the millions of Americans who have this option available to them will take advantage of it, and that will be a very good thing indeed. John Carl.
Jay, are these briefings essential? Will you continue to brief?
We obviously believe it's important that the American people be apprised of what's happening here at the White House, and we will endeavor to provide that information as best we can with a skeletal staff.
Are you confident that this will be a political disaster for Republicans if there's a shutdown?
I wouldn't make any kind of predictions, and that suggests that we're looking for an outcome. I'm not. I mean, I don't know, and honestly, I think it's important to know that we don't care about the politics of this. The president cares about making sure that the American people aren't hurt by it, because we talked about this with regards to the comprehensive immigration reform legislation that passed with a strong bipartisan majority in the Senate, and there were some questions about whether secretly we didn't hope that the Republicans in the House would block it because it would be continued bad news for the Republicans when it came to their ever worsening relations with Hispanic Americans across the country, and the answer is no. We would love them to take advantage of the political opportunities available to them by passing comprehensive immigration reform and maybe improving their standing among Hispanic Americans by doing it. And we would love for Republicans to do the right thing and maybe improve their standing among the American people and Congress's standing among the American people by simply not shutting down the government and not defaulting on our obligations.
So can I just go through very quickly some of what the Republicans are demanding and what's negotiable, what's not? The debt ceiling, nothing there negotiable, right?
Correct.
The idea of repealing the health care law, obviously not negotiable. Delaying the health care law for a year?
No. As part of, first of all, the answer is no, and nothing is negotiable when it comes to the debt ceiling. And as the president said recently, when it comes to extending the government, it's like he's willing to talk about ways to improve the health care law if Republicans are interested in that. After all, a lot of the Affordable Care Act is designed, its essential elements were designed by Republicans. You'd think, and I believe, that there are Republicans out there who probably earnestly have some good ideas, although they're most likely afraid to talk about them in party circles. But the president is eager to do that. What he is not willing to do is have those negotiations under the threat of shutting down the government, and certainly not under the threat of defaulting on our obligations.
So the idea of delaying this tax or cutting this tax on medical devices also?
No, I answer that with NEDRA. That's not. Look, Congress has, throughout its time in session, the opportunity to consider and pass legislation to try to get majorities big enough in both houses to achieve a compromise between the House and the Senate and present it to the President. That's the way it worked. It is supposed to work. And as you know, the House Republicans in particular have done little else over the past couple of years than attempt to legislate ways that either defund or repeal or other ways negatively affect the Affordable Care Act. So that they can certainly endeavor to keep doing that, but to have that attached to the simple responsibility to fund the government is just not acceptable.
So is the reason why we've seen really no negotiations going on because basically everything the Republicans have put out there is not.
But that's not a here it is. It is not it is not a concession to keep the government open. It is not a concession to pay America's bills. That is a responsibility. And as I emailed with a reporter out here, it is enshrined in the Constitution. Congress has the power to pay debts. Congress has the power to authorize funding. If it were otherwise, the president would go about it, and there would be no drama and no delay.
So last question, what is the president doing over these next several hours to try to keep the government running?
Again, it is not, unfortunately, within the president's power to pass legislation on the Hill.
Well, what's he doing?
The president said that
what's he doing over the next?
The president said just moments ago that he will certainly be. He expects having conversations with leaders in Congress, but it is pretty elemental here. There's an option to keep the government open. There's an option to shut it down for ideological reasons, and he would not presume to have the power of persuasion within the House Republican caucus that perhaps John Boehner does, or perhaps other leaders in that conference, rather, might have. Let me move around. Chuck.
The president said he was open to negotiating on the budget.
So we're going to continue monitoring Jay Carney, briefing the press there on the latest developments in Washington, D.C. But in the meantime, I want to bring in our political director, Rick Klein, to talk about this. Rick, the big statement, you tweeted this out, and I retweeted it as well. Jay Carney saying this is blatant extortion. Tough words coming from the White House, and a House that appears to be pretty steadfast in its conviction.
That's right, and this is a White House that is confident about its position, even as the House has dug in on this. We heard Jay Carney also say that I don't care about the politics. Well, that is not the truth. They're very much attuned into the politics of this, and they feel like they are winning the political argument, and that's one reason that they are relishing the position that they're in right now. But let's be clear, tomorrow comes if we don't have government funding, very bad things start to happen. A cascading series of events in a partial government shutdown. There's only one president, and the conventional wisdom has been that Republicans will take the blame. They took the blame when we had the shutdown in the mid-'90s, and Bill Clinton benefited politically from that. I don't know that it's necessarily, though, the same playbook moving forward.
That shutdown for 21 days, in fact, that happened from the end of 1995 to 96 there. So certainly this is something that is uncharted territory. If, in fact, it does happen, the length of time it could happen. Just to recap a little bit, at noon today, the House did convene. At 2 o'clock, in just a couple of minutes now, the Senate will convene. But earlier, House Speaker John Boehner had this to say.
Yesterday. Well, my goodness, if there's such an emergency, where are they? It's time for the Senate to listen to the American people, just like the House has listened to the American people, and to pass a one-year delay of Obamacare and a permanent repeal of the medical device tax.
So, Rick, the question is this. If the bottom line is about compromise and about some kind of a conciliatory attitude in Washington, D.C., why don't Democrats in the White House see it that way?
Because Democrats in the White House feel like this isn't something they have to compromise on. They know that Republicans don't want to shut down the government on this. They know where the polls are on this. They know that Republicans, by and large, feel like the only thing they could do poorly politically here would be to prolong this shutdown. They've made their point. So Democrats just don't feel like there's an incentive to negotiate over the government shutdown. They feel like they've been told all along that the Republicans don't want this. So it would be silly of them to give in something at this late stage. Their expectation continues to be that House Republicans blink.
I want to get your reaction to something that Senator Barbara Boxer had outlined today, perhaps an inspirational move for Congress to keep the government funded. Here's what she suggested.
act like a Speaker of the House, not just like a Speaker of the Republicans, and pass my bill so your people don't get paid. You'd be surprised how fast they'll come to the table.
So the big question is, Rick, what is this bill that Senator Boxer is talking about?
Her bill would deny pay for members of Congress during a government shutdown. Their pay is currently protected by the Constitution. So even one of the ironies is if Congress fails to do its job, they still get paid, explicitly get paid under the Constitution. Her idea, and there's been bipartisan support from this in both the House and the Senate, is to say, let's share the pain as members of Congress, at least feel the bite that furloughed government workers, potentially troops in the field, are going to feel if there's a government shutdown. So it's the idea, it's the kind of idea that makes so much sense that it's almost bound not to happen, because there's so much other protracted fighting going on in Washington. But yeah, a lot of folks have asked that question. Will members of Congress get paid? The answer, unless Senator Boxer's bill gets passed, is yes.
Now, of course, we have no answer to find out exactly what's going to happen in the next 10 hours from now. If you can, though, try to play it forward a little bit to October 17th, when the nation will reach the debt ceiling. How will negotiations now, how will the back and forth between both chambers and between both political parties have an effect on whether or not that debt ceiling gets raised on the 17th of October?
This fight is spring training for the big league event that's going to happen in a couple of weeks, because the consequences are so much worse. Now, you could argue it out a few different ways. There's a school of thought that says Republicans will feel like they got their mileage out of this last fight. They did what they could do. They made their point, and let's not screw around with the debt ceiling, that if we go past that, we're going to potentially be defaulting on debt. There's another school of thought that says, look, if Republicans walk away empty-handed from this fight, they're going to go into the next fight truly energized to go to the mat, to make a big fight over Obamacare and what have you. And what complicates this is the president has said there will be no negotiating over the debt ceiling. He has made it larger than even this policy fight and said it would upset the balance of powers in the Constitution if we were to start make concessions around Congress's simple responsibility to pay its bills. So you have two sides that are coming at it in a very different direction, and this clash will look like nothing compared to the brink of October 17th.
And in fact, the president did outline his position and his conviction earlier today when he was meeting at the White House with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And I want to play just a moment of that, those comments that he had earlier this morning.
Thank you so much. Are you resigned to a government shutdown at this point, and given how close we are to the midnight deadline, have you had any conversations with Speaker Boehner over the past few days?
I am not at all resigned, and I'll have a chance to obviously speak more to this. I'm going to have a cabinet meeting this afternoon, and may have some further thoughts for the press as the day goes on, but the bottom line is that the Senate has passed a bill that keeps the government open, does not have a lot of extraneous issues to it, that allows us then to negotiate a longer-term budget and address a range of other issues, but that ensures that we're not shutting down the government and we're not shutting down the economy at a time when a lot of families out there are just getting some traction and digging themselves out of the hole that we've had as a consequence of the financial crisis. I've said before, Congress has two responsibilities: pass a budget, pay the bills. And I am not only open to, but eager to have negotiations around a long-term budget that makes sure that we're investing in middle-class families, helping the economy grow, giving people who are working hard a leg up, and greater security and stability, and deals with some of our long-term challenges in terms of debt and deficits. But the only way to do that is for everybody to sit down in good faith without threatening to harm women and veterans and children with a government shutdown. And certainly we can't have any kind of meaningful negotiations under the cloud of potential default, the first in U.S. history. There's not a world leader, if you took a poll, who would say that it would be responsible or consistent with America's leadership in the world for us not to pay our bills. We are the foundation of the world economy and the world financial system. And our currency is the reserve currency of the world. We don't mess with that. And we certainly don't allow domestic policy differences on issues that are unrelated to the budget to endanger not only our economy, but the world economy. So yeah, I suspect that I will be speaking to the leaders today, tomorrow, and the next day. But there's a pretty straightforward solution to this. If you set aside the short-term politics and you look at the long term here, what it simply requires is everybody to act responsibly and do what's right for the American people.
All right, and that were comments that were made just a little bit earlier today at the White House with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu by the president's side there. Rick, I want to get your thoughts on this because the president had said essentially the same statement last week that you don't mess with the U.S. currency, you don't mess with the U.S. reputation in the credit markets, speaking to the debt ceiling that'll be approaching on the 17th of October. Is that the message that the White House is most holding faith in to convince members of the House not only for this current budget debate, but for that future debate?
They don't want to ever have another debate over the debt ceiling. White House aides have acknowledged privately to me and to many others that they made a mistake by ever suggesting that it was part of negotiations. It happened in 2011. They know that if it happens again, very bad things could result. If you're going into that every time where the minority party says we're not going to raise the debt ceiling unless you do X, then you're making that a condition of the negotiations. You're changing, as the White House says, the balance of power as delineated in the Constitution. So they don't want to go there ever again. They want to just make this a core responsibility of Congress, which it has been since the debt ceiling first came about 100 years ago. Congress does it. The president signs it. They don't like doing it, but it's part of the responsibility of governing, and that's the way the White House wants to leave this.
And what is happening right now, I want to pull up a live feed if we can. The Senate is actually voting right now. It just convened a couple of moments ago after the Senate chaplain did call back into session. Rick, procedurally, walk me through this. If you can, give me a governmental operations 101. What will happen now in the Senate?
Well, the last action was in the House. They approved overnight Saturday a bill that once again sent to the Senate a bill that would fund government operations by delaying Obamacare by 1 year, the individual mandate delayed by 1 year. This is the Senate voting to send it back to the House. Technically, it's a vote to table the motion, puts it back in the House's court. This ping-pong game has been playing out over the better part of a week right now. So now the House of Representatives has about 10 hours to respond to the Senate's latest gambit. They could again try to do something else, put something else as part of this continuing resolution just to keep the government continued operations going, or they could decide to accept it and be done with the entire mess. The likelihood is that they try once again, even though the time is short, to send something back to the Senate. Harry Reid and Senate Democrats aren't in a rush necessarily. They took yesterday off, even after the vote overnight on Saturday, because they wanted to run out as much of the clock. Like when you're up in a football game, you try to eat up the clock. That's what was going on, and now only 10 hours left to find something that could be doable in the House.
If the Senate does run out the clock, as what you did, as you pointed out yesterday, and now goes back over to the House, can they run it out again even to this very last moment, if in fact the House does vote on something today?
Senate is very good at consuming as much time as possible. Now, there may be public pressure brought to bear on Democrats to make sure that you act as promptly as possible, because a question of blame will quickly enter into this equation as soon as we have a potential shutdown. People will ask, what happened? Well, if Harry Reid spent the night out at dinner instead of voting, then I think he's going to bear some blame for that as well. So they have to be careful not to look like they're doing what we all know what they're doing, which is try to back the other chamber up against the deadline as much as possible.
Yes, and of course, with all eyes watching in Washington, D.C., it'll be very difficult for them to actually pull anything like that off. All right, Rick Klein, thank you so much, sir. We know that you're going to be busy this afternoon, and we, of course, will continue to keep you updated. Before we let you go, though, we'll let you know we're going to be live streaming both the Senate vote that's occurring right now and also Jay Carney briefing the press at the White House. A complete report on abcnews.com. For now, I'm Dan Kleffler in New York with this ABC News Digital Special Report.